Okay, what is up there, YouTube? This is J-Man Time. I have a video on rare tanks and armored cars of the Norwegian army used during the Second World War. Of all of the neutral countries that were invaded by Germany, I would say that Norway is one of the top 5 most unprepared countries that were invaded during the early years of the Second World War. On the 9th of April 1940, the German army invaded Norway and quickly annexed the country, one of the fastest blitzkriegs during the war. During the years before World War II, Norway had attempted to create its own units of armored fighting vehicles, but it never really managed to produce anywhere near enough vehicles to defend itself during the German invasion in 1940. Keep in mind, most of the Norwegian military budget at the time was spent on the Navy and the Air Force and some of the Army regiments. So most of the funding for the Norwegian Army was relocated to other uses. So tanks and armored fighting vehicles were really on the back burner during the 1930s and just before the invasion of Norway in April 1940. So let's go over some of the tanks and armored fighting vehicles that were in service with the Norwegian forces during the Second World War. And the first tank on the list is the Landsverk L-120, also known as the Rikstanken in Norwegian, which means national tank. The L-120 was actually a rare Swedish experimental vehicle that was ordered also by the Norwegian military. It was one of 2 light tanks. It was based on the older model Swedish Stridsvagn L-60 light tank. The L-120 had a main armament of one 7.92mm Norwegian Colt M1929 heavy machine gun. Its armor thickness was between 15 and 20 millimeters. This was mixed armor made of both steel and iron. Its speed was 25 kilometers per hour or 16 miles per hour, and it had a crew of 2. Now, only 2 of these vehicles were produced and only one was delivered to Norway in 1937. This tank was originally ordered in 1936, but the tank was actually delivered unfinished in 1937. As a result, the Norwegians had to complete the vehicle themselves by using iron armor. When the vehicle was delivered, it was delivered without a turret or main armament. It was supposed to be armed with either a 20mm Madsen autocannon or a 37mm Bofors anti-tank gun or tank gun, but neither of those were provided, so the Norwegians had to improvise by slapping on one of their Colt M1929 light machine guns, which was a redesign of the American Colt Browning M1917 water-cooled machine gun, but chambered in the 7.92mm Mauser. And only one of the Landsverk's L-120 Rikstanken was delivered to the Norwegian army and actually served in the Norwegian army all the way up until the invasion. Strangely enough, when the Germans invaded in April 1940, this vehicle was actually not operational. It, along with several other armored fighting vehicles, were left in a Norwegian storage yard at the Norwegian army base at Gardermoen, was actually a Norwegian air base that also doubled as an army base for the 1st Dragoon Regiment, which was the name of the regiment or division that was given this tank in the years before World War II. And the 1st Dragoon Regiment didn't have time to prepare the vehicle, so they simply left it in its storage warehouse, and this vehicle was later captured by the invading German armies in April 1940. Now, after the fall of Norway, this vehicle was actually used as a propaganda tank by the German armed forces, also known as a souvenir tank also, where it was used for propaganda purposes, where German occupation forces would photograph themselves either driving around in the vehicle or just simply posing with the tank. It was also used as a cheap training tank by the occupying German forces also, all the way up until at least 1942, 1943. Afterwards, this tank simply disappeared. There's no real way of knowing what happened to this vehicle after 1942, 1943. Some historians believe this vehicle was probably dismantled or simply melted down for its metal. But the Landsverk L-120 Rikstanken Norwegian was actually the first Norwegian tank and the only true Norwegian tank that was at least listed as in service during the German invasion of Norway in April 1940. The Landsverk L-120 was not the only armored fighting vehicle listed in service with the Norwegian Army in April 1940. The Norwegians also had several improvised armored cars or limited production armored trucks that were in service with the Norwegian Army starting in 1940. And the first of these armored trucks was the Panzer Bill 21. And the Panzer Bill 21 was a 6x4 cavalry armored truck designed in 1940. Now, going back to 1936, the Norwegians realized they were going to have to produce their own armored fighting vehicles in case of an invasion by the Axis forces in a future conflict. One of the first vehicles to be designed was the Panzer Bill 21, and this was an armored truck, as I just mentioned. The main armament of this vehicle was two 7.92mm Colt M1929 machine guns, one fitted in a turret and a second one fitted in the chassis. The vehicle also used small arms, 3 Norwegian Krag-Jorgensen rifles, and a small number of handguns as the secondary or third line armament of this vehicle. Its armor thickness was between 6 and 12 millimeters, but its speed is largely unknown. The vehicle had a crew of between 4 and 6. Only one Panzer Bill 21 was completed before the German invasion in 1940. Now, this vehicle was also abandoned at the Norwegian base at Gardermoen, along with the Landsverk L-120 light tank. And this vehicle was also used as a propaganda vehicle or souvenir by the occupying German forces, and was also used as an occupation vehicle by the German forces also. But the Panzer Bill 21 was the first Norwegian armored fighting vehicle, wheeled armored fighting vehicle, to enter service just before the German invasion in 1940. Now, the Norwegians also produced 2 other versions of the Panzer Bill 21. The second version was known as the Panzer Bill 22 and the Panzer Bill 23. Now, these were 2 slight modifications of the original Panzer Bills. Keep in mind, all of the Panzer Bills on this list were actually based on the Swedish Panzer Bill M31 and M36 series of armored trucks, which were also serving in the Swedish Army. And they were basically the same vehicle. It's just one was produced in Sweden and the other was produced in Norway, using 2 different chassis, but the outward appearance was basically the same. The Panzer Bill 22 had a slightly increased armament of one 12.7mm machine gun and one 7.92mm Colt model 1929 heavy machine gun, plus 3 rifles and pistols, just like the previous vehicle. The armor thickness and the crew capacity was pretty much the same, and just like the previous Panzer Bill 21, only one Panzer Bill 22 was completed, with the second vehicle being renamed the Panzer Bill 23. Now, the Panzer Bill 23 pretty much had the same specifications as the Panzer Bill 21 and 22. The Panzer Bill 23 was pretty much the same as the Panzer Bill 22. The only difference is it was actually a downgrade, as the 12.7mm machine gun was replaced with a standard 7.92mm Colt model 1929 machine gun. So these were pretty much the only armored fighting vehicles in the Norwegian Army during World War II, and they were all stationed at the Norwegian Army base / air base at Gardermoen, also known as the 1st Dragoon base at Gardermoen, which just so happens to be the 1st Dragoon Regiment's main base or headquarters. And remember, the 1st Dragoon Regiment was the unit that were issued both the Landsverk L-120 Richthofen and the Panzer Bills 21, 22, and 23 experimental or limited production armored trucks. And that was basically it. The Norwegian Army really didn't have many armored fighting vehicles. They mostly relied on either horseback or standard unarmored vehicles like flatbed pickup trucks and some unarmored cars as their standard issued infantry vehicles. And as a result, they were simply overrun by the more advanced and more experienced German army. And so there you have it. These were the only armored fighting vehicles I could find that were in service with the Norwegian Army during the German invasion in April 1940. Which of these vehicles were your favorite? Obviously, my favorite is the only tank on the list, the Landsverk L-120, Rikstanken. But what are your favorites? Please tell me in the comment section below. And until next time, this was J-Man Time signing off.